Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Directors Seminar. I'm Professor Henrietta Moore and I'm the Director of the Institute for Global Prosperity. And it's my very great pleasure today to introduce Danny Kruger, who's a Member of Parliament. He's Conservative MP for Devizes. He was elected as a Member of Parliament in December 2019. Before that, he was political secretary to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 10 Downing Street, and formerly the government's expert advisor on civil society at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. Before he became and did all of that, he founded and led two charities, the Criminal Justice Project Only Connect and the West London Zone for Children and Young People. He has a PhD in history from Oxford University, and he's the author of On Fraternity, Politics Beyond Liberty and Equality. And tonight he's going to talk to us on the subject of his report, which came out recently and has had a profound way in which we in the IGP are thinking about how to work with communities post-COVID. So Danny, please can I offer you the floor and welcome to the IGP.
Thank you, Professor, and I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon and looking forward to the discussion which will follow my remarks. I thought what I'd do is just set out in quite broad terms what I think has happened in our politics in the last 4 or 5 years, and then try and account for that with an analysis of the economic doctrine which has dominated our politics and our culture for so long. And then refer briefly to the extraordinary events of the last year and how I think that has impacted our politics and our thinking. And then ask the question that Lenin asked, what is to be done? And think about the next steps and how we can mitigate and respond to the very profound challenges our society faces, but also build on the immense strengths that have been revealed in recent months. So let me try and answer the question of what has happened since 2016 when the Brexit referendum took place. What was that about? And I account for it quite simply, deliberately simply actually, because I think it was essentially a simple phenomenon. And I tried to describe it in my maiden speech when I became an MP a little over a year ago, when I said that the Brexit vote, in my view, is a response to the call of home. People across the West and in the UK in particular were voting for the traditional connections that attach them to the people and the places that they love. And they were voting against what they took to be an institution in the EU, but more profoundly a culture and a doctrine and a way of thinking that that denigrated home and those homely attachments. And in that sense, the Brexit revolution, which it's a fair way to describe it, was really a counter-revolution. It was a response to an earlier revolution, which was described by Christopher Lasch many years ago as the revolt of the elites. And what Lasch described a generation ago, and very presciently, was a culture among the ruling class in our country, and he described this happening in other places as well, but in the UK, where, he described mostly about the US, but it applies to the UK, where the culture of the rulers in politics, the media, in the academy, and to a degree in business and in other institutions in the law, had become severed from the common culture of the country. And that revolting culture, the culture of the revolting elites, was essentially one of globalism and of identification with humankind, rather than with the people and the places that they were supposed to serve, the people of the nation. And of course, that earlier revolt, that revolt of the elites, was in itself a reflection of something that was happening in the economy. the global economy, which was driven by ordinary people, which was consumer pressure for cheap goods from abroad, which ended up with, and I should mention, with enormous increase in manufacturing capacity abroad. So we have consumer pressure from the West, producer pressure from the East, which obviously results in the outsourcing and offshoring of manufacturing, and therefore the loss of the economic underpinnings of much of the Western economy, and the transformation of the Western economy, which favoured those with particular skills and assets, and led to the inequalities that we're familiar with. And this phenomenon is best described if you're familiar with a graphic often called the elephant graph, which shows the way that if you imagine looking at an elephant in profile from the side, and what you're seeing is growth in incomes over the last 30 years, and the great bulk of the body of the elephant is the bulk of the population of the world, which has seen immense growth in incomes because of globalization. So the world's poor, the ordinary people of the world have seen an increase in growth. The back of the elephant's tail, is the world's poorest, and they've seen very little growth. And then you come to the front of the elephant, and the elephant's tail, the elephant's trunk, again going high, is the rich of the West. So those with the assets, the cognitive advantages, the networks, the education, the skills, the access to opportunities, have done extremely well out of globalization. But the crucial bit of the elephant graph for our politics is the elephant's face, which falls. So if you imagine the picture, and the elephant's face is the middle classes of the West, and it's those people, ordinary people in the West, who have not prospered anything like the way that the bulk of the world's population and the elite of the West have prospered. And all our politics is really, I think, due to this simple fact of the contrast between the elephant's face and the elephant's trunk. And it's the revolt of the face against the trunk is what we've seen. So let me try and articulate in another way what our politics and our economics has done. And I describe it in the report that Professor Moore referenced, which is what I call the doctrine of economic mobility. We've had an idea since the 1970s that left to themselves, capital and labour will find each other. And so which of course what happened in industrialization in the 19th century. Basically innovations happened, capital rushed in to invest in factories, labour rushed in from the countryside to man those factories, and you had a pretty effective, lucrative synthesis of capital and labour through the natural processes of the free market finding each other. The expectation was that would happen as we deindustrialized. As jobs withdrew from our northern towns, labour would withdraw too, and would go to the places where the jobs were. Meanwhile, capital would come into those towns because suddenly you had cheap labour and cheap land. And so there would be a natural process of adjustment. In fact, that isn't what happened. Labour didn't leave these towns in anything like the numbers that theory should suggest. It turns out that places are sticky. It turns out that people are actually attached to the towns that they grew up in, where their family are, places with the sounds and sights and smells of home. And even if there might be the opportunity for a job 50 or 100 or 200 miles away, people didn't feel they didn't have the desire or the confidence or the networks or the skills to move to those jobs. And meanwhile, nor did capital flow into those places, because it turns out that capital needs more than cheap land and labor. If a business wants to invest in a place, it wants to invest in a place. And what it turns out is that businesses like viable places to invest in. They want places which have a culture, an environment, the human capacity that makes them want us as a business to settle there and to invest. So the doctrine of economic mobility has dominated our politics and culture for many years, and yet it hasn't really delivered and hasn't worked. So, and we see that by the fact that the same people and places who were, as it were, the victims of deindustrialization, the places which were lowest on all the measures of prosperity and well-being 40 years ago, are the same places we're worrying about today. And the response that we've had over these years, and Labour and Conservative governments, pretty indistinguishable in this regard, has been a strategy of mitigation to try and make it life a bit better for those people and places, rather than to change the underlying fundamentals. So for people, there we've had a strategy of welfare, of providing individual benefits to people on low incomes, and providing public services, again aimed at individuals through individual entitlements of healthcare or education, employment support, which treat people as isolated units with particular personal needs. We've modernized that model over the last generation, starting with John Major, but more under Tony Blair, under the doctrine of new public management, which basically tried to say we need to be providing welfare, but let's do it in a slightly more market-like way, with private companies delivering services, or at least try and make the public sector resemble the private sector by creating internal markets and using unit costs and all other sorts of devices of the market to try and stimulate efficiency and responsiveness to users, or consumers as they even became called in some parts of the public sector. So that's been our model on people. And then on places, recognizing that despite the doctrine of economic mobility, despite the investments in welfare, depressed places remain depressed. There have been a series of piecemeal, short-term and inadequate attempts to mitigate the decline of place and the impact on these communities, which we could discuss in detail if people are interested. But none of those have particularly worked either, in my view, because they've been too small and too piecemeal. So that brings us up to date, and that was where we were scratching our heads when I went into number 10 with Boris Johnson when he became Prime Minister. What is the strategy for the places which are suffering and have suffered for many years? That was our legacy. What's the new approach supposed to be? And then COVID hit, and so let's just come up to date now with what happened over the last year. And there are some very bad things and some very good things that have happened in my view. So the very bad things that have happened in this space are we have seen a radical widening of the inequalities which persisted already. And that doesn't just mean life has got worse for a lot of people, which it has. It also means it's got better for a lot of people. And it got better for the people who are doing okay already. And that people like me, who, I spent the first lockdown in a cottage in Wiltshire. I spent 3 months with my family, having every meal with them, going for walks in the most beautiful countryside, watching the spring and summer come in, skies clear of aeroplanes, families cycling along the lanes, shopping locally, and getting to know our neighbours. Meanwhile, the people who I had lived and worked among a few years earlier in the White City estate in West London were cooped up in tiny flats, and with all of the challenges around education and those pressures. So we've radically widened the gap in our country. It's not just been rural and urban, by the way. There are many people in urban places who've done well and many people in rural places who've suffered, but I just described that in sort of personal terms. And then the other very bad thing that has happened, although I hope it will have a bit positive legacy, is we've really discovered the dysfunctions of our statutory systems. And I don't want to, and it would be impossible to give an accurate account of the mistakes and the difficulties that our state has encountered over the last year. We need time to understand that. And I'm by no means trying to exculpate ministers from their responsibility for decisions that have been made. But I think just concentrating on ministerial decisions and on the heroic work of people on the front line in the public sector is to miss the more profound factor in our COVID response, which is the systems of the state, which should have anticipated, prepared for, and managed the challenges of COVID a lot better than they did. And again, it's too early to say exactly how and what should have been done differently. And I certainly don't think any individuals are really responsible for this. But I do think we have discovered that the state, I'm not talking about the politics of the government, I'm just talking about the state, has been lacking in lots of respects. In many respects, it's been absolutely outstanding, and there's been brilliant work done by parts of the system, but it hasn't been brilliant. And so I think we've made a discovery, and that discovery is that paradoxically, we need a strong state, but with real capacity at the centre. But we do not want an over-centralised system of government. And that's the paradox we need to work through, and it might be worth unpacking in the discussion. Because we've simultaneously, over many governments, over the decades, centralised power in the UK, and in England particularly, let's just talk about England, so that local government doesn't have anything like the autonomy and the flexibility that local government does in other countries. But we've also hollowed out the centre, so that, and ministers complain about not having the agency over the government itself that they would like. So we have a lack of capacity at the centre, but also a lack of autonomy and independence in the regions. So how have we managed that, and how can we fix it? I feel like important questions. So those are the problems we've had this year, but the positives have been, firstly, a remarkable degree of flexibility in the system and in the state. So while there's been loads of dysfunctions, we've also seen more on the front line where action has to take place, where people are just thrown in and had to respond. And in the NHS, which has been a classic offender in terms of, operating like a fortress, not cooperating with other bits of the system, and often quite bureaucratic and slow moving. The local NHS became extremely adaptive and extremely collaborative in the way that people have always wished it were. The same applies to other bits of the public sector. Councils responding very flexibly, for instance. So that's the first good thing. The second good thing is what has been really apparent and so encouraging and cheering, heartwarming, has been the upsurge in neighbourliness, the personal work that so many of us have done to just step forward. And I mean, it doesn't hardly takes any effort. You sign up to a WhatsApp group saying, "Does anybody need any shopping done?" And that so many people, millions and millions of people, have volunteered for the first time in this last year. Existing social infrastructure, voluntary groups, charities were mobilised and performed heroically. And as I said, and it was our experience in Wiltshire, you meet your neighbours in times like this. And then the third thing, which is kind of related to that, really, is, and a great positive, the fundamental blessing, positive legacy, I hope, of this crisis has been a cultural shift. What I described earlier about the call of home, the desire for home, I think what we're seeing is that the middle classes, professional people, not just working class Brexiteers, have discovered home, place, and community. And there is now a general desire. It was growing already. You had it in the organic food movement and in the environmentalism and all sorts of these important shifts that were happening among the middle classes anyway. But that is now, I think, attached much more firmly to place, and people want to belong to places. And you see it most obviously in a massive increase in house hunting in rural areas and in towns and villages. So people are literally deserting the city, and that speaks to a more general cultural change that's happening, which is a newfound desire for the old ways of living and working, closer to home, more connected, more local and more sustainable. And that is the great legacy, I hope, of COVID, that we've discovered place, we've discovered each other, and we recognise there's more to life than accelerated globalization and getting and spending. and we have the emergence of a new doctrine. So let me finish with the question: what is to be done? And I very pleased to hear that at least Professor Moore has had a look at my report, and if any of you have seen it, you'll see what I think should happen, and happy to run through some of that in the discussion. But in a nutshell, I think we have this enormous. I don't want to suggest this crisis is an opportunity, but it presents an imperative. Actually, is a better way of putting it, that we change a lot about the way we work, and I think that we have an unfrozen moment now. We have an opportunity to do to rebuild in a much better way. I hope that we will do less mitigation and more transformation, and that means strengthening the foundations of our country. And what that means in a meta sense, in the big picture, is, in my view, that we need to fundamentally recognise that as individuals we need to belong to strong families, strong communities, and a strong nation. And it's those identifications and associations that give us our sense of self, our identity, also our safety, and our freedom. And going back to my point at the beginning, I think the Brexit vote was fundamentally a vote for that, and I don't think that's gone away. We can talk about family and nation if people are interested, but in light of this debate and my report, the community bit in the middle is where I think there is huge opportunities to translate that into policy. And as I say, I set them out, many of them out in my report. But what I think we need to be doing is moving away from people-based services, which just think of individuals as recipients of passive recipients of some kind of service provided or entitlement provided by government, and think more about places and how can we, if we put funding and responsibility into local communities and allow them to blend that funding in a way that delivers the services that individual families and individuals need. So bringing together pooling budgets and using them to create preventative systems, not just remedial services that clean up or try to pick people up once they've fallen off the cliff. We should, classically, as people say, put fences at the top of the cliff, not ambulances at the bottom. And and even though fences are a lot cheaper than ambulances, we still have to find the money to put the fences in. And that is the great challenge, because that's long-term preventative funding that isn't critical, whereas ambulances are always critical because people are always falling off cliffs. So how do we change the political culture to invest in fences? And I'll end with this. A vision of individuals is not just recipients of help, but actually the people providing the help. And in fact, and getting away from the notion of help altogether to the point that we are all, as we did in the mutual aid phenomenon of this year. I mean, when I was self-isolating, our neighbours did their shopping for us, then we did shopping for them. And we are, rather than having a essentially paternalistic model of people in need and then people providing for them, we need to be working as the tradition, the great self-help revolution of the 19th century, which was the foundation of our welfare state, was. It was a mutual principle, and with neighbours supporting each other. And we need to get back to that ethic, I think. And we have a more empowered citizenship that way. So I will end there, and very happy to discuss in any more detail the proposals I make in my report, to run through any of that you're interested in. But Professor, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your remarks, and you started with Christopher Lasch, which is a very interesting starting point, because of course when he wrote The Revolt of the Elites, then the subtitle of that book, if I recall, is The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy. So there was a real sort of sting in the tail of his critique then. And I'm just thinking, and I know that we've talked a lot about it with colleagues before, about why is it that governments really across the world seem so threadbare at this moment? So do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, I do think is there a crisis in democracy? Is that part of the story you're telling?
Yes, I do think there is a crisis in democracy, because we've hollowed out what democracy is. We've reduced it in the way that we've reduced public services to the idea of individual, units with an essentially passive role in society. But every 4 or 5 years they get the chance to drop their individual anonymized ballot into a box, and we say that's democracy.
Mm.
Democracy emerged in the West as the idea of a capable citizen playing a role in their community. Obviously, it was, you know, men only and free men only and so on. But the idea was citizens who could vote were the ones who had the capabilities to vote. And obviously, to begin with, the vote was only for the landed and then for the educated and so on. But the doctrine behind that was voting is a responsibility that requires, as it were, some capabilities in the voter. And I think we need to recover the notion that to be a citizen is to be active and to be capable, and that's what I think people are wanting. So we're trying to reclaim democracy, and I mean we fundamentally need, you know, formal democratic oversight over our institutions, which is why I supported Brexit. We do need to, you know, there was in a sense a betrayal of democracy over many years, people's loss of the sense that their representatives were in charge. But we need to go well beyond formal representative democracy and deepen democracy into much more community-based agency and empower all sorts of community groups with political power. You know, politics is the art of managing people living together in a community. And that doesn't just mean voting every few years. It means taking an active role. Yeah,
no, I think that's interesting. And I think there is a worrying crisis around how people participate and how they live together. So when we're thinking about levelling up communities and indeed all the things you put in your report, one of the things that I've said quite recently in stuff that I've been writing is that there are a few phrases out there, you know, the Great Reset and Build Back Better and many of these phrases which are sort of exhortations to a different future or towards a different future. But one of the things that I'm concerned about is how much do we really know about how we're going to get there? I mean, in other words, are there clear pathways, or are there even sort of little routes through the forest that we can follow? Because in your report, you do, I think, recommend, if I remember rightly, a £2 billion fund for levelling up.
Yes,
which is one of those it's the title of your report, and also one of those sort of phrases as well that's important for us at the moment. But do we know how to level up, do you think, or do we even have a clue, really?
It's a very good question, and the answer is no and yes. So no, we don't know what works in individual places, and Paul Collier, who has written about this a lot, talks about radical uncertainty of what works, and you know, therefore it would be wrong for us, you know, in London to try and design success for Sunderland or Plymouth, and if we knew what worked, we would have done it already. So no, we don't. But what we do know is, or what we have a legitimate expectation of, in my view, and again, Paul Collier is very good in all of this, is to by liberating places, allowing experimentation, and sending sort of cultural signals that it's okay to experiment. And that's a big, very important point, because we're so centralized. We have a very risk-averse local government. And even if councillors, local political leaders want to innovate, often the officers who do the work locally are very scared. And so we need to signal, and this is where there is an element of top-down, signal the right to innovate. So local independence is important, and crucially, the other thing that Collier talks about, which I very much recognise and agree with, is places need to build on their own legacies of industry and of culture and of heritage, and everywhere's got assets, and everywhere should be building on what it's got, and investing in the sense of place. And that's why what appear to be non-economic assets, you know, like a football club or like a historic association with a defunct industry like lace making, you know, or tobacco. Devizes, where I'm the MP, had a big tobacco industry. Well, what can we do with that? Well, there's all sorts of interesting offshoots that the tobacco industry created locally that could be built on. Or a place I know a bit through a friend in the Lake District, they've had a paper mill, you know, for 300 years, and now that the skills associated with paper making are very appropriate to all sorts of modern industries. So history is powerful. I'll answer your question more quickly. We do see things happening in a really positive way in lots of places, small places often. The big cities, we're familiar with the success of central Manchester. Well, that's just we've just replicated London there. That's great. We need to do that in lots of big cities. But actually, it's the wider towns around Manchester, and Wigan is one I often point to because still pretty depressed place in lots of ways on the economic indicators. But actually, there's been a huge renaissance in social capital there and a sense of positivity because they had good leadership under the Labour Council, I should add. And they're doing a lot of stuff around civil society and volunteering and community responsibility. So I think these themes about trusting people locally, building on local traditional assets, the heritage of the place, and recognizing that communities are important, the foundations of the economy. I think those principles do apply everywhere, but the expression will be very different from place to place.
Yeah, I think that's very important because we often talk about what's wrong, but we very rarely talk about the things that do work. And you could look to Wigan, you could look to Preston, you could look to quite a number of places actually who've done really innovative things. And it's interesting that we don't trumpet their achievements quite as much as we should. And I think that's something that we could all learn to do and to share a bit more. But it also made me think about when you were talking about issues. We will go on, I'm sure, with others in this discussion in a minute or two to talk more about the relationship between individual, community, and government, because that is, of course, it's a philosophical and a knotty problem as well as a practical problem, and one that's got a great deal of ideology around it in many contexts. But the other is about the idea of public spending. So one of the things that's been important is that we do have one of the most regionally unequal countries in Europe, and we've often put a lot of money into different areas and seen very little back. In other words, spending hasn't always been well targeted. This is a big problem. But government spending, if it could be focused on sort of social purpose, which is partly what you're recommending, could have really a really massive impact. And the question is, how do we get that right, do you think? What sort of conversation should we be having about public spending that people could join in with in part, other than the NHS, which everyone understands?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think the point about conversations that we could join in is central. And as I mentioned, we have a very centralized country, which means that too much of our public money is administered through the Treasury, and local government and local public services are basically just delivery agencies for outposts of the central state. So just by localizing funding more, and that includes, in my view, more revenue generating powers for places, for cities and counties, but sort of more fiscal autonomy for places will help through just the natural process of local democracy. But I think, as we were discussing earlier, we should take a step beyond formal democracy and say, and beyond representative democracy, and have a more direct democratic element to public spending and tax raising as well. There are models around the world and small experiments in the UK around participatory budgeting, which basically put the onus on citizens to have the conversation that politicians have the whole time, which is, this is how much money we need for what we want to do. How do we raise it? What's the right spending of the cash that we do have? I mean, in Wiltshire, we're thinking about, leisure services, libraries, lots of things have been closed during the pandemic. How do we reopen these when there's not a lot of money around? What would be people's priorities be? So I think more and more participatory spirit around that. But fundamentally, what we need is a mix of the right mix of capital and revenue spending. There's not enough revenue spending to go around, and when we think about social infrastructure, it's not enough just to hand over a capital asset to the community or find a capital fund that people can bid into to build something. How's this thing going to be run, and what's the best use of public money to keep a service in operation? And we need the right mix of short and long-term spending as well. And the great challenge we have, well, one challenge is siloed spending. So the health service can't collaborate with the criminal justice service, when in fact the same person is going to be a cost to both, and the right intervention will save them both money. And the other problem is the time frame. So the saving from a investment, people can recognize, let's spend some money on the cliff, the fence at the top of the cliff, but we're not going to get the return on that in terms of averted people falling off a cliff and averted ambulance expense for 10 years. It won't be worth it until after this budget cycle, and after this budget cycle doesn't exist because we're only responsible for this budget. So pooled budget, long-term budget, and getting the capital revenue mix right. These are the enormous challenges which government struggles with. And then finally, just what is value for money? I mean, what do they count? What matters and what to measure? And can you measure the value of a library over a new train line? Very difficult, even though we can all intuitively get it, and there are modelings to suggest you can, a library adds X to local GDP or whatever. But fundamentally, these are things which perhaps shouldn't be measured. The pleasure of a child reading a book, well, is that in their future earnings or in the enriching experience that they've had from reading? So going beyond a purely quantitative analysis of the use of public money is a big challenge for us too.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's a good moment actually to open up to the floor, because one of the first questions that came down the line is from Kitty Parker Brooks, and she's asking, how do you suggest we shift political attitudes in funding from ambulances to fence building? How do we make that move? Because it's quite a difficult move to make, isn't it?
I'm afraid I'm going to give a sort of rather standard answer, which is the more we have these conversations, and the more we give voice to the people who intuitively get this, which are the people who tend to fall off cliffs or to pick them up, the more we will create a politics that makes this necessary. And actually MPs, I think, do get it. I think the challenges are in the Treasury and possibly in the Public Accounts Committee, which holds government to account for spending, and the cultures there are fairly orthodox around what good looks like. But as I say, I think something's happening, and change, I'm afraid, happens. Well, not afraid, it just does. It happens from bottom up and top down, and the bottom up change can be fairly sort of turbulent, as we've seen in the last 5 years, when there's essentially a political rebellion by voters. But it can also happen through a sort of percolation of one part of the elite revolting against the other, and I think we are seeing, in this increasing focus on a more sustainable, more local way of living among the middle classes, the cracking in the structure of the current model, and the more Treasury civil servants whose children grow their own vegetables and move to the country, the more we'll see the culture change. So I think we're seeing it happen. So simple answer to the question is, it's happening, but we need to push it, and the more we can highlight the sort of, you put it, Professor, the more we can champion the sort of work that's happening in Wigan and Watchet, my favourite place down the Somerset coast, where I've never actually been, but I'm in touch with them, and they're doing something amazing through the arts to regenerate this town, with culture, literally culture-led regeneration, the most marvellous thing. The more we can champion that kind of work, the better.
Yeah. So somebody is asking, who's remaining anonymous, but is saying, in your opinion, does place-based and community-based targeted policy and funding equate to a kind of political and economic devolution? And we might think about, should there be limits to that, perhaps?
I do think this is part of the broader devolution agenda, or rather, I think devolution is part of this agenda. And I mean, the way I see it is the take back control motto for Brexit needs to be continued, and we need to enable places to take back control. And if all we do is bring back power from Brussels to London, we will have failed the people who voted for Brexit and missed a great opportunity to reset the balance of power in the country, and that it would be a great disappointment if that's what we ended up with. So we do need to push ahead with devolution within England. I think it's for the devolved nations to decide to what extent they want to localise beyond Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast, and think about a more local settlement there. But in England, I strongly believe we need more elected mayors. We need more autonomy for county councils and cities. And I'm not a great believer in regional devolution. I mean, I recognise the value of city regions and the sort of economic hinterland around our big cities, but still, I think we need devolution to geographies that people recognise and identify with. And that tends to be places with names that are older than last year. As I say, counties and cities. But as I've said, I think we need to do more than just devolve power to another tier of democratically representative government. We need to think of that as a necessary step to the more profound change that we need, which is a more empowered citizenry, where communities have a greater role and responsibility and a right to take power into their own hands and design services that work for them.
Yeah. We've got a question from Jack Isaacs, and he's saying there are local organisations all over the country already doing vital work for communities, and West London Zone being an example. But does government plan to collaborate with social investors to support and expand these kinds of organisations?
Yes, thank you. Very good question. And it does, of course. I mean, there is a very significant engagement between government and social investors, and the different bits of talking to the Treasury today about it. In fact, there is a genuine recognition that private money for public good is one of the great assets of our country, and that private money doesn't always have to earn a commercial return. And there are many people and institutions who would be glad to put their money up at some risk for some return if they felt it were helping to help the people and places and the causes that need it. I mean, the story of social investment over the last 10 years has been a winding one, a bumpy one, and I think that's because it's in a sense a new market, and it's difficult, and it takes a while particularly for big institutional investors to get the confidence in a new way of investing that they are prepared to risk their clients' wealth in that way. And so I think we've got a little bit way to go to embed a culture of social investment, but we are world leaders in it, and it's not going away, and it's definitely the way ahead. And I wish, and I'm pushing for more recognition of that, and I'm hopeful that we'll get some good news on that. I mean, we could get into the social investment tax relief if you like. Not everything has been as successful as it was hoped. But I remain very confident that this is the way to go, and the government does too. It's just a question of what is the right way to stimulate that sort of investment.
Yes, and presumably some of this investment can also be localized, can't it? I mean, so there are, that's how 19th century philanthropy worked very successfully in a way. So,
well, I mean, I completely agree. It would be tremendous if we could generate an expectation or a culture of investment in places, often from local businesses or individuals who've done well, or those who come from there. I mean, I'm a big believer in the idea of diaspora philanthropy or diaspora investment, where people who've come from a small, often quite impoverished town in England end up in London or California or wherever, but still think that such and such a place is home. I know they're not going to live there anymore. They still want to invest in the place. So I think there is a big opportunity there.
So the next question is from, I can't see whether this is André or Alain, but anyway, Planteau, and he's asking, you emphasize the importance of the sense of belonging to family, community, and nation. However, since everyone and everything on the planet are interlinked, what about a sense of belonging to humankind and the earth? And how do we reconcile these different senses of belonging?
Well, that's a good question. I think I take my everything I believe in comes from Edmund Burke, and you'll be familiar with the famous quote: "To belong to a subdivision, to belong to the little platoon, to be attached to the subdivision, is the first link in the chain by which we proceed towards the love of our country and of mankind." So local attachment is a step towards national attachment and global attachment, and I do recognise that. I am, and I think there is a sense in which, very fundamentally and most obviously, we are all part of one human family, and we have an obligation to all people everywhere and to the planet that hosts us. And we could discuss sort of foreign policy and climate change and so on. I think there's a huge, very interesting sort of agenda that relates to what I've been describing on that front. But I would say this: the difficulty of identification with mankind, with humankind, and with the planet is often either implicitly or explicitly in conflict with local and national identity and responsibility. And I'm always struck by that story in David Goodhart's book, The Road to Somewhere, in which he describes sitting between the head of the BBC and the head of the British Civil Service at an Oxford dinner. You were probably there, Henrietta. And at which these two, the absolute pinnacles of the British establishment, agreed, sitting, across David Goodhart, that they felt their responsibilities were to the world, not to Britain. That their job was to serve the greater good, not the national good. And I think that doctrine, that sort of mindset, is very prevalent in our elite, and I think it's very, very problematic. Not because we shouldn't be concerned about the greater good. Fundamentally, we should. But what is the best way to serve the greater good? Well, it's to have responsibility to the people you're responsible for, and enable them to be as strong and successful and virtuous as possible. That is the way to serve mankind. And I think about, in more practical terms, I'd apply that to thinking about the nation, to the environment and to the climate. The way to serve to reduce emissions and to help the countries most affected by climate change is to ensure that our country's doing the right thing, living well, and we should be thinking about the well-being and the security of the British people. And then we find that actually mitigating climate change, reducing emissions, and helping the poorest countries in the world is in our national interest. So I do very much believe in what the question implies. However, I just want to warn against a notion that the idea that the world should somehow trump family and nation and community, because actually I think we need to start close to home with our own responsibilities we all have to our own families first of all, then to our communities, our nations, and that is the way we develop our love for mankind.
And we have a question from Charlie Stott, whom he's asking, how do we cultivate the capabilities for voting that you referred to? Is more education and critical thinking needed to help people see through fake news and conspiracy theories?
Yes, I think this is it's a good question about education, and I think we have fallen into the trap in the last, into my lifetime, of thinking that the education system serves the economy only, and therefore what children should acquire are the sort of abilities to operate in the 21st century economy, which of course they do need, but fundamentally they need these skills to manage life in a community, and that means having the interpersonal abilities, the virtues of relationship that are fundamentally needed, and of course are most needed for the economy as well, the sort of economy we're getting into, which is fundamentally not going to be one of who's got the best technical skills, because the robots will do that. It's who's got the best human skills, who can relate best to people, and develop the capabilities of creativity and compassion that are uniquely human. And so I think we do need a reset of our education system, and yes, we need to invest in the citizenship of young people, and your question about fake news and disinformation is very well made, and we need people who can discern the truth. And again, I come back to my point about strong communities where people trust each other. That doesn't mean communities that are inward looking, isolated and distrusting of others and outsiders. We need communities which are outward looking, but we do need young people to grow up with a sense of self and knowing who they are and having the confidence to see beyond the often very comforting lies that conspiracy theories engender.
Yes, I think perhaps we also need some challenge in the conversations that we have with each other, because we keep talking to our own echo chambers. That's one of the problems with social media, isn't it? So the next question is from Konrad Michevich, and he's asking, would granting greater capital raising powers to local authorities help or hinder levelling up of the British economy, do you think?
Well, my instincts are always to say, yes, let's give local authorities more power. And yes, I think I understand we are liberalising the rules around borrowing, so it is possible for local authorities to raise capital for investment more easily. If the question is about tax raising, then yes, I think we should. We know, there was a reason why in the 1980s the government, Maggie Thatcher's government, basically centralised the British state, because so much of it was so badly managed by dysfunctional hard left councils, in London and Liverpool and elsewhere. But I think we've moved on, and I think we need to go back to a situation where places, major proud cities like London and Liverpool, can be responsible for their great degree of their own finances. We'll still need a distribution mechanism. The South East will continue to subsidise the rest of England for a long time, but what we do need to empower places with more money raising powers. And fundamentally, and relevant to your seminar's evening, we need a model of inclusive growth whereby it's expected that every part of the country will be contributing to overall GDP and prosperity, rather than a essentially distributist model whereby we turbocharge the Southeast and then take some of the proceeds of that growth and distribute it to the poorer regions of the UK. We need a more inclusive and better spread of growth. But I do think local fiscal autonomy is an important part of that.
Yes. And we've got a question from Brenda, who's sort of question that follows on from that. So she's saying, that how do you overcome, though, nearly all governments' reluctance to devolve real power, funding and income generating powers down to the local level? Because governments don't want to do that very often, do they?
They don't until they do. I'm sure people have said for 30 years before 1998, how are we ever going to get the Westminster to hand powers to the nations of the UK and to London, and then suddenly they did. And so I think it's just a question of what's the political atmosphere and what are the calls for. The challenge is, how do we strengthen the central state to make it more capable and more resilient and better able to cope with crises like the one we're going through, while also giving power away to places. And I think that's the sort of head scratcher, because we have both a weak and a centralized system. And I think if we can answer that question, if you just think, which is a fair assumption, politicians and civil servants are power hungry. But if you say to them, we're going to give you more power because we're going to give you a more dynamic, efficient and lean and agile state to play with. But we want to disencumber you of the difficult responsibilities of worrying about Sunderland and Exeter. Then there's a sort of deal to be done, as it were. So I think we need to, as I say, I think we need to think about beefing up the centre while also localizing.
Yeah.
So I'm not an anti-statist. I really believe in government and in central government and in what goes on in Whitehall. I just don't think it's doing it very well at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. So now we've got a question from Saffron Woodcraft, who's a colleague in the IGP, and Saffron's on the panel, so she can ask you herself, actually. Saffron, are you there?
I am. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your reflections. Really interesting to hear what you had to say about devolution. I just wanted to ask a question that's a critique really that you will be familiar with, I think. So thinking about the points that you were making about social capital and the importance of neighbourliness, and the political dialogue around the question of neighbourliness and belonging that's emerged over the last 10 years in relation to active citizenship. So you will know from your own experience of working in charities in the third sector that there is a concern in some areas that the idea of active citizenship itself increases and exacerbates problems between affluent and deprived neighbourhoods, in the sense that it places more burden and pressure on the kind of third sector within places that are already struggling. So in that context, and in the context of your comments around community empowerment and the kind of support for devolution to very local areas, how do you propose in practical terms that after a decade of austerity we can rebuild the capacities of the third sector, and we can address some of the areas where public sector funding has been withdrawn significantly, in order that in wanting to empower communities, we're not putting even more pressure on deprived and disadvantaged areas that are already doing an enormous amount in terms of mutual aid and support within their neighbourhoods, and have been doing so for decades and decades. So in the sense that the vision of place that you describe and the vision of the rediscovery of kind of localism that you describe in Wiltshire is something that, you know, deprived and disadvantaged neighbourhoods in urban areas live with on a day-to-day basis. Place is important. Social capital is not only important, it's essential in order to survive because of the withdrawal of the state and lack of employment opportunities. So what can we think about in practical terms to kind of invest and rebuild those capacities?
Well, as you say, or implied, the disadvantaged places have a particular asset in the social capital that exists there. I mean, they don't all, no place is the same. And just because a place is disadvantaged doesn't mean that it's a wonderful, warm community. Often it's not, but nevertheless, it is often the case that particularly long-term disadvantaged places who have had multi-generational disadvantage have a spirit of community and a sense of social mutual obligation and affection, which is an enormous asset to the place. And that is something that actually, you know, other parts of the country which are more affluent don't have. And what I was describing was in this last year is, you know, nice places in Wiltshire have discovered themselves in a way that, you know, Bolton and Wigan already knew themselves. So actually, I think we've had quite a positive sort of transmission of an idea from less affluent places to affluent, how to not commit the mistake of the big society, which was to appear to impose responsibilities on places which were very hard pressed and people who are very hard working, often for no reward at all or for very little, and basically say we've got no money, and anyway we don't really think the central state's very good at this anyway, so you get on and fix your own problems. How to avoid that impression, because I don't think that was really the message of the big society, but I know that it came across like that to some. The answers are, I think what we need is to really do what the big society promised and never properly did, which was to transfer wealth and power to the poor communities of our country, very bluntly. We need to make large-scale transfers of responsibility and resources to those places. And I would do that by the sort of democratic innovations we've been discussing. So genuinely enable places to take charge, not instantly and immediately and in every regard. It takes, particularly for less settled communities, sort of places I've worked in London, where they've been poor for years, but with the kind of local population changing every decade. So it's not a settled place with strong links. For a place like that, it takes a while, a long time, for the community to develop the relationships and the kind of mutual understandings to develop their own agency and the ideas for change that should be implemented. So it's not immediate, but we need to transfer power, and we need to transfer wealth. And I'm calling for large scale investment in social infrastructure. I'd like to have a new endowment set up, sort of some billions to invest over the long term in social infrastructure. I mean, the government is putting a lot of money. There's a £4 billion levelling up fund announced by the Chancellor towards the end of last year, which is explicitly aimed at the places that need support. And we're waiting to hear what the design of that fund will be, I hope quite soon. So I recognise your point about disinvestment over many years. I mean, it is the fact that austerity hit hardest the sort of places we're talking about, because while healthcare funding and education funding weren't actually cut at all in real terms, their growth declined. Likewise, welfare spending. But what really was reduced in real terms was local government funding, and therefore they had to spend their diminished budgets on their statutory responsibilities, which is mostly adult social care. And so they cut the youth services and the libraries and the parks and the support for the third sector and all the things that we really recognise the need for investment in. So that has to be addressed and has to be acknowledged and then addressed. And I think there are ways to do that. So yeah, funding and power is my answer, Saffron.
Very good.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, did you want to add something?
Well, I was just keen to hear from others on proposals for change and how there's a budget coming up, and as I said, it feels like this great moment of possibility with if we can suddenly decide to subsidise restaurant meals and pay for laptops and pay for the furlough scheme. Why can't we think about long-term profound changes? So yeah, would welcome any suggestions for policy.
Good. Okay. Well, we'll tease out a few suggestions for policy. I mean, you probably know that in the IGP we've been working on something called universal basic services, and so that's really about social infrastructure.
Yeah.
And about directed investment in that, and that's been part of a broader sort of shift in thinking away from thinking narrowly about innovation and employment to thinking more about secure livelihoods for people and good quality livelihoods and quality of life. So to focus on quality of life as the starting point of any kind of inclusive growth, rather than doing the inclusive growth first and hoping that quality of life follows.
Yes.
And we've talked quite a bit about what that would mean. We've got a few. You've generated quite a bit of excitement, so we've got quite a few questions in the pipeline. We've got one from Nikolai Mintchev, who's saying, "Thank you very much for your talk. Could you talk a little more about the need to belong to a strong community? How do we deal with these tensions between different perspectives and what makes up a strong community? And how can we manage these diverging conceptions of community based on different types of relations, such as cultural and ethnic, class and political commitments, including ideas about national belonging?"
Well, thank you very much. What a difficult one. Yes, I mean, it is easy to talk about community, and it is because we all have our imaginings of what that means.
Yeah.
And we can get quite romantic, as I have over the years. I mean, in spite of all my experience of actually dealing with the blasted things. You know, I mean, on a most basic level, you know, the essence of community is volunteering. You know, it's like stepping forward for no particular financial reward, but just because it's the right thing to do, and because you have and you get something from being generous to others. You know, managing volunteers is incredibly difficult. So this is a fallen world. Nothing is perfect, and we cock up everything all the time. So let's not be rosy-eyed about what community can look like. And of course, in reality, you know, the English tradition, say English, over centuries has in many ways been about the liberation of individuals from communities. You know, we've had a very, you know, a mobile population. You know, people. You know, that's why we led the Industrial Revolution as much as for any other reason, because it was possible and encouraged for people to get up and move and to break free from what could be a stultifying and indeed oppressive local community. And you know, let's not replicate the worst models of you know, oppression with a sort of reheated communitarianism. You know, we should distinguish between bridging and bonding capital. You know, are we just reinforcing the connections of people like each other, or are we enabling people to connect with people who are different from them? And we need to do a bit of both. I mean, it's quite okay to like people like you, but we need to have communities which are open. I suppose my rather feeble answer to the question is that I put so much faith in empowerment. You know, I think the reason why why Trump supporters in America are often so offensive and, you know, borderline racist, if not fully racist, and politically violent in many cases we've seen, it is because of a sense of impotence and disempowerment. And I have hope that by putting power into the hands of the people who've been denied it, we will discover an essential generosity, and if we inculcate the virtues, if we develop, you know, conditions in which people can become their best selves, which is about, you know, stable families, good education, a sense of hope for their futures, then we will have communities which are diverse, full of all sorts of different people, and yet bonded. But it's never going to be easy. And as I said, politics is the art of managing people living in communities, and politics is challenging. And you know, we're never going to live in complete harmony. But I think we can create systems in which that is more possible. And these are the kind of conversations we need to be having.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Now we've got a question now from Matt Davies, who's one of my colleagues at the IGP, and he's on the panel, so he can ask it himself. Matt.
Hi, Danny. Thanks for a really thought-provoking set of comments. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And my comments have sort of got larger and larger as the debate and discussion is going on. So hopefully I won't take too long. But I think this picks up on the questioning that Saffron was really asking about. And so I'm personally very much in favor of localizing decision making and budgeting, and I think much of what you say really rings true with my own sort of stance on this. But I also grew up in Caerphilly in South Wales, which in a heavily marginalized part of the country, very strong Labour heartland, and I think there it might be perceived in a variety of different kind of ways, this narrative. And to play devil's advocate to some extent, I think many would like it there, but many others would probably see this to some extent as a classic piece of sort of conservative politics, which is basically to say that the Westminster government isn't there to solve local issues. It's not there to develop universal services and solutions, and the onus is on individual areas. And these are areas that often perceive themselves already as having underinvestment and a perception of marginalization, and that the onus in this kind of narrative is on them to address their own problems. So my concern often is that this could be seen as a narrative which is not about necessarily inclusion and leveling up, but is about atomization, is about each for their own, is not necessarily about leveling up, but potentially about sort of supporting existing forms of status quo. And I know that's not what you're arguing for at all, but I'd like to hear a little bit about how you might counter some of those arguments. And so how do you go beyond the perception that devolving decision-making and localizing might be perceived as an attempt to devolve responsibility, to absolve Westminster, to absolve Whitehall, to the localization of solutions to problems is also a localization of the problems themselves that should be addressed nationally. And many people there would think that there should be national solutions to these kinds of challenges. And perhaps just to finalize that, and sorry for the long comments, to pin you down a little bit more, what should be national and what should be local? What would a national welfare system look like in your vision of the world?
Well, very good, Matthew. I appreciate that. Yeah, you're absolutely the right challenge, and I probably don't have enough of an argument in response to it, to be honest. I mean, enough of a response. Yes, I mean, as I tried to say to Saffron, I think there is a danger that it looks, rather than liberating places, it looks like cutting them adrift, cutting them loose and saying you're on your own now. And I'm not sure that just giving them more money will necessarily offset that impression. That could almost compound it. It's like take some money and go away. So I recognise that challenge. To a certain extent, there is no answer to it. To be blunt, where there is an embedded attitude that problems are for Westminster to solve, then Westminster saying we're not going to solve these problems is going to be a difficulty. We have to change the expectation that everything can be done from London, but the challenge will be a legitimate one in many cases. The reason why South Wales has remained in the difficulties it has over some generations isn't because of any particular failings on the part of the South Welsh. It's because of national policy and globalization, and the national government has a responsibility for that. And as I tried to say in my remarks, I just think we got deindustrialization wrong. We misunderstood the process by which places would adapt to the withdrawal of industry, and we need to make up for that. But I do think the way to make up for it is not to sort of replace nationalized industry with a nationalized welfare system or another national form of nationalized economics, but with a spirit of empowerment and of the flexibility that is required for levelling up. As I was saying, the Paul Collier approach of recognizing that places are going to grow in different ways, but it cannot be look like the state, let alone the Tory establishment sort of washing its hands of these people and places. And I'm not sure, sort of from a narrative perspective, what the best way to do that is, other than by being plausible and genuine and sincere in the commitment to them. And fundamentally, is it true? Would it be true that the Tories were basically disinterested in these places and wanted to get on with having a nice time in Kensington? Well, if it is true, then that we shouldn't be in power. So we just have to be genuine about this, and I suppose partly a way of representing that. And this is, I guess, is a challenge to the left, and it's a challenge for the Labour Party at the moment. Is I think that we need a national narrative, but it shouldn't be about national economic planning so much. Although I'm all for industrial strategy and thinking about the whole nation's economy, but it's about having some cultural national identity and being seen to be pro-British. And that's what I think what people have revolted against, the sense the government didn't even believe in the country they were in charge of. So I hope that the people from Caerphilly and elsewhere would respond to a sort of patriotic, Wales, one question, just think about the English places we're worried about, would respond to a patriotic government that genuinely believed in the need for their communities to be revived, but didn't think that only the man in Whitehall knows best. So it is a very difficult balance. Thank you for the question. And if you or others have got any answers to that challenge, then I would be pleased.
Are you coming back, Matt, or you were just raising your hand and thank you?
Yeah, well, thank you for the response as well. And I mean, if we're talking and starting to think about what are potential possibilities and ways to address some of these challenges, there are a couple of thoughts from your response that sort of spring to my mind. So I think one is it's the depth of this the kind of nationalism that we might be wanting to cultivate to some extent, right? Which I think is really interesting. So the my experience of South Wales actually is that many people are very, very patriotically British, as well as patriotically Welsh, and that it's not a simple sort of rejection of England and the Westminster government by any means, but that there's a need for them to understand a sense of nationalism as one which is a very, very heavily structured inclusion within the country, which often manifests itself in a desire for national services, for the idea that we are part of a structure which is looking out for us. And therefore a localization and a denationalization kind of narrative in many ways then is problematic and undermines that sense of being part of the nation, and drives the success of Plaid Cymru and others, right? And so what we are looking for, what I would think we should be looking for then are national schemes, which are very clearly national, but which have that localized adaptability in some way. So you're not saying, okay, you design your solutions in your way over there. What you're saying is we have a grand plan, which is totally national, but there is considerable room for localized expressions of that. And I think without trying to sort of champion things we've been working on, universal basic services, which Henrietta brought up earlier, has some neat elements in it like that, which are talking about, okay, this is a national welfare service, but what are the localized expressions of that national service? And I think a narrative like that works more strongly in a place like South Wales than a purely localization agenda.
Okay, and I think Saffron wants to add something on the end of that. Whoops, we lost Danny for a second. Saffron, do you want to just add your?
Yeah, so just briefly, I think Matt's point is really important, because I think what we're talking about here in a sense is the technical structures of devolution and the mechanisms and partnerships and vehicles that are put in place. I think it's not about local communities having a reliance on national government, but it's about thinking about how the strategic, how they can be part of strategic conversations around problem solving. So at the moment, if you think about much of the discourse on devolution at a community level is around engagement in the management of public spaces, thinking about libraries, thinking about community responses and services. But actually what Matt's talking about is the ability to bring local experience into strategic decision-making, into statutory services and decisions which really take place at the moment at a different level. So I don't think that requires, although I'm a fan of devolution, I don't think necessarily the devolution of power and funds just to cities or local government will address that disconnect. So it would be really interesting to hear what you have to say about those kinds of mechanisms. Do we need more devolution in order to have a different kind of dialogue and citizen engagement in strategic decision-making? Yes, when it comes to the distribution of funds, but I think that's much about culture and innovation, potentially, and different kinds of working.
Yes, I agree with that. And yeah, I mean, I agree with everything actually that's been said, and Matt put it well about what, I mean, I found this when I was working in prisons. It's remarkable. What struck me at the time as a sort of, conflict, disconnect, contradiction, was prison governors or prison officers actually who would slag off the prison service like anything, and governors who would object to the fact that they couldn't order, loo roll without getting, had to be bought through the Ministry of Justice. But when I'd say, why don't we just mutualize or hive off prisons, they can be independent, like academies or free schools, running their, they're independent organizations, and they can employ their staff directly and set their own terms. And suddenly everyone goes, oh, no, we want to belong. And officers in particular, very proud of the HMPS, Her Majesty's Prison Service badge, and epaulet, which connects them to a national institution, even though they despise the leadership of the national institution. They want to belong to it, and and I agree with the. So what we need is national schemes with local application, and I agree very strongly. And I think I'm hoping we'll see out of this crisis the emergence of that sort of thing. And I've been particularly keen on a sort of national volunteering reserve to step up when there are crises like the one we've had, or when there's flooding, but also to do ongoing environmental projects and to help with all sorts of sort of standing things that need to be done, like help with the lonely and the elderly and children needing help with catch up and all this. We need to bring together people to do that. And I think they should be they feel like a part of a national workforce effectively. But everything they do is organised locally and has a local feel to it. And Saffron, I agree that, as I've been saying, I don't think that formal devolution is sufficient, and in many ways it's not even necessary to the sort of changes we're talking about. And you're right, it's about culture and innovation. I do think having a plan to devolve and to enable places to take back control from London will be culturally useful as well, because it'll send a signal about the sort of country that we are and could be. But no, most fundamentally, what we want is people having a voice and some influence and agency over the organisations that affect them most directly, which are public services, not what local government might do. Yes, and we do need a great challenge about what the future of the NHS should be and how that should be organised. Likewise, social care. But I believe we could get to a model that's more localised and more kind of mutual, with greater patient power or citizen power, as well as more responsibility for the professionals who are delivering services. So the model we need has a sort of formal and an informal dimension to it.
Thank you very much. Well, we've just got time for one more question. And of course, the conversation you've just had has provoked a question from Roman Malan Hiscock, and he's asking, do you think that empowering citizens at the local level will do enough to dampen calls for Scottish independence?
Well, I do think, so it's interesting how the Scottish government has greatly centralised power in Scotland, and that might be the best model. It's not a big country, and it might be best to be highly centralised. They have one police service for the whole country. Local government is more enfeebled than English local government, and it might be that insofar as the UK has the capacity under the devolution arrangements to empower places more. I mean, I think the sorts of changes we've been discussing could potentially be introduced through the UK government, but ultimately it'll be for Holyrood to determine that. But paradoxically, I do think, it's just perhaps strangely, I think that a part of the cause of the sentiment, Scottish nationalist sentiment, and the desire for many Scots to be free of the UK, the problem is the disempowerment of England. It's the fact that there is no English government. There's a UK government that governs England and has some residual powers over the other nations. And I would like to see the UK government becoming the UK government and allowing England to be more self-governing. Whether we have an English government or not, a big discussion to have, but certainly Westminster shouldn't be concerned with all the details of local public services in England. And acknowledging Matt's point about and Saffron's point about not looking like Westminster's washing its hands of communities. Nevertheless, I think by devolving power more within England, we will essentially free up Westminster to do its proper job, which is to be the government of the whole country, to be providing national leadership, not local public service management. And we might then, more Scots might recognise that what the UK government is doing. So I think we do need a great rebalancing of power across our islands. But as an English MP, I'm primarily concerned with ensuring that, that we have more power. So yeah, I mean, fundamentally, let's start with Wiltshire, and then everything will be all right.
And then everything will be all right. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful hour and a half, and for answering all our questions, and sharing your ideas with us. We've really enjoyed it and appreciated it hugely. And because we have the panel with us today, we can do something rather old-fashioned in the time of Zoom, and that is that we can give you a round of applause. So thank you very much. And we do hope
it was my great pleasure. Thank you all for your very interesting and stimulating questions, and you've challenged me and helped me think all this through even more. So I appreciate it, and thanks for your time today.
Not at all, not at all. Hope to see you at the IGP again soon. So
Indeed.
Thanks very much, everyone.
All the best. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye-bye.